Dos.
Bienvenidos al ciclo de conferencias de investigación Universidades por la Ciencia, organizado por Fundación UNAM, el Colegio Nacional y el Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia. Les agradecemos mucho el interés y el día de hoy tenemos una conferencia muy especial a cargo de la doctora Julie Cole, quien es investigadora en la Universidad de Michigan en Ann Arbor. La conferencia es sobre uno de los temas pues más interesantes que tenemos, el estudio del niño, el fenómeno del niño, que se propaga a lo largo de las costas desde Perú hasta México, y es uno de los fenómenos que afecta el clima en la Tierra. Y la doctora Julie Cole es especialista en ciencias marinas, en oceanografía, y estudia los corales, y el día de hoy nos va a presentar sobre los estudios que se realizan en la parte del Océano Pacífico tropical en diferentes zonas, incluyendo Galápagos, México y demás. Well, thanks very much. Welcome to the University for Science Consortium seminar series. Today we have a talk by Professor Julie Cole from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Dr. Cole is a specialist in marine sciences, oceanography, and she has been studying the corals, the coral reefs from many different places. And today she will present a talk about El Niño. This is one of the major oceanographic and climatic changes in the oceans, propagating from the Central Pacific, from Peru all the way to Mexico and California. Dr. Cole is a professor in the University of Michigan, and she has been working on marine coral for a long time. She's also doing experiments in the biosphere too in the University of Arizona, so we are extremely happy. Thanks very much, Dr. Cole, for accepting this invitation. And Julie is also a very good friend, so we are particularly very happy of having her. Nos acompañan en el panel el presidente de Fundación UNAM, Dionisio Meade, la directora ejecutiva de Fundación UNAM, Araxi Rodríguez, la presidenta del Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia, Araxi Urrutia, y nuestra conferencista invitada. Thanks again. And voy a pasar la palabra a nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM, Dionisio Meade. Nos da también mucho gusto que la presentación se haga después de estas semanas en que tuvimos la conferencia de Naciones Unidas sobre cambio climático. In the past few weeks, we had the conference of the United Nations on climate change in Baku in Azerbaijan, and this just showed the interest, the interest of the nations in climate change. Is one of the it's a challenge to everyone. So this is part of these studies, and the oceans are the thermoregulators of our climate. So we are extremely happy. Muchas gracias, y Dionisio, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Agradecemos nuevamente al Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia la oportunidad de tener otra vez una conferencia en este día sobre un tema tan trascendente como el que tiene que ver justamente con el comportamiento del niño. Agradecemos la presencia de la profesora Julie Cole de la Universidad de Michigan, y acredita pues la riqueza de nuestro consorcio, en donde pues contamos con especialistas de la propia universidad, o como en este caso, en una presencia de la Universidad de Michigan a través de la presencia también de la conferencia de la doctora Julie Cole. Es para nosotros un gran privilegio, honra la trayectoria del consorcio y nos da oportunidad de reflexionar sobre uno de los temas pues, que más han afectado a la humanidad en los últimos años, como es el tema del cambio climático. Sin duda, para el caso nuestro, el comportamiento del niño es uno de los que mayormente inciden en el comportamiento de nuestro clima y su evolución, su trayectoria, su futuro, pues habrán de incidir también en la trayectoria de nuestro clima en los próximos años. Como dice el doctor Urrutia, es bien útil que esta plática se celebre a unos cuantos días de que ha concluido la reunión de Azerbaiyán, en donde otra vez se volvieron a plantear pues, los mismos temas, los mismos problemas, quizá con más conciencia. Después de la pandemia, sin duda, el cambio climático y el cuidado del planeta son algunos de los que destacan en nuestra agenda personal y nos motiva mucho que nos acompañen en esta audiencia pues jóvenes que están definiendo su perfil profesional, especialistas académicos de la UNAM y de otras partes del consorcio, que hoy nos acompañan en una presentación como esta sobre un cambio tan trascendente. Agradecemos mucho a todos su presencia y damos las gracias a la doctora Julia Cole. Thank you very much for your presence here today, and we are very happy to have you here today. Thank you very much, and we are ready to hear your presentation. Thank you very much again. Gracias, Jaime, gracias, Araceli, gracias a todos por acompañarnos en esta tarde, en esta presentación del consorcio. Gracias a todos y muy buenas tardes.
Muchísimas gracias a ustedes para invitarme a dar esta charla aquí a todos, y lo siento que no tengo la habilidad de darlo en español completamente porque no hablo español bastante bien, pero agradezco mucho la oportunidad de hablar con ustedes sobre este tema muy importante para nuestro mundo y nuestras vidas. Voy a compartir mi pantalla aquí. Sorry. Y voy a cambiar a inglés ahora. I apologize, I was not at the beginning of my talk here. Let me set it up properly. Can everyone see this well? Okay. I'm going to be talking about how the phenomenon of El Niño is changing over the past millennium, and I'm going to use an unusual source of information for that, the histories of climate that we can obtain from corals that grow in the tropical oceans. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, and I understand that I'll have a fairly diverse audience, and I look forward if we have the opportunity for questions at the end, because I always learn a lot from the question and answer when I speak to a large group. So you may ask the question, why El Niño, and why corals, and why the Galapagos? I'll be focusing on records that we've gotten from the Eastern Equatorial Pacific and the Galapagos Islands. And so I want to tell you a story first about corals in the Galapagos. In 1989, I was a graduate student, and I had the opportunity to go to the Galapagos and sample corals to better understand climate change in Galapagos. We were planning to sample large, long-lived corals that others had documented that had been living there for 100, 200, maybe 300 years, growing ever larger over that time. And when we got there, we had everything we needed to find those kinds of corals. We had maps that people had prepared. We had someone with us who had seen the corals. But when we got in the water and looked around, they were gone. And it turns out that that's because in 1982 and 1983, there was a very large warm temperature anomaly associated with the El Niño event of that time, as shown by the map here, that had killed off over 95% of all the corals in Galapagos. Now, this picture in the background here is not taken in Galapagos, but it's a coral reef that's effectively dead, and it gives you some idea of what that might have looked like at that time. We don't have pictures from then of the Galapagos, but that was a real eye-opening experience for me to go to a place like Galapagos where we knew there were long-lived corals, only to find that they had all been killed. Because of the different organisms in the water that like to eat the coral skeleton, none of those skeletons were preserved. So they were just gone. They had turned into sand. So that awakened my interest in the Galapagos. And I later temporarily gave up on the idea of sampling corals in Galapagos until a friend of mine contacted me and said, we think there's some fossil corals in Galapagos, and would you be willing to go back and look at those? And I said, well, sure. And that got me back into working in Galapagos. And since that time, we have been able to sample both fossil and living corals for the purposes of understanding the records of climate that they preserve. So now I'm going to unpack that a little bit. Corals, especially the ones like shown here in this image. Let me move this off to the side. Okay. Corals grow throughout the tropical islands, and they can live for centuries. So this one pictured here is a little over 1 meter tall, and has probably been growing for over 100 years. As they grow, they preserve a record of the conditions under which they grow in the chemistry of their skeleton. So as they grow, they incorporate different kinds of chemistry that tell us about past temperature change, for example. And so we can use cores from a core like this, which starts at the living surface at the top and goes all the way back through time, to better understand a history of climate, to reconstruct a history month by month of how climate has changed in parts of the remote tropical ocean where we don't have instrumental records like from thermometers going back very far. So today's talk, I'm going to outline a little bit of how we do that. I'll start with the context of this work. What is the El Niño system? Why is it important? It is a major uncertainty in future climate change. Background information on how long-lived corals track temperature and therefore El Niño variations in their geochemistry. And I'll show you our results, which is that Eastern Pacific corals from the Galapagos show a clear climate signal that gives us a hint about ongoing trends and possibly future changes in El Niño. And then talk a little bit about some of the future work and implications for this. Just to show you where we're working, this is a map of the sea surface temperature anomaly associated with the El Niño during 2015, 2016. And the Galapagos sit in this green square. I've blown that map up here to show you the main part of the archipelago here. And then up to the north, some other islands, part of the Galapagos that we often don't see on the maps, but that are also important for this work up here in the north. Why is El Niño important? Well, El Niño plays a very important role in climate, both in the mean state of the global temperature and also in the variability. Over the last couple of years, we have seen record-breaking temperature, and the El Niño that began in early 2023 played a major role in driving the heat that we have experienced. So this is an animation of temperatures from the United States National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, and you can see this warmth across the tropical oceans ending in 24, but this is going to start again in a minute. Whoops, sorry. This warm spell across the tropical Pacific here is the El Niño system. All right. This is a map, this is a data set showing the warming of global temperature from 1950 to present. And you can see that this has been warming dramatically in the last few years. You can also see from the colors that many of the warmest years in this record, as climate has warmed, have been El Niño years. So global warming has ups and downs, right? And the ups tend to be El Niño periods, and the downs tend to be what we call La Niña, or cooler periods. Okay, so El Niño is an important piece of the global warming story. And the question that I want to ask is, we can see that El Nino plays a role in global warming, but the question I have is, does the warming change how El Nino behaves? And that's a question that we don't have a lot of data to bear on. Okay, let me stop for a minute and just remind everyone, what are we talking about when we talk about El Nino and La Nina? El Nino and La Nina are two sides of one system. These are defined by sea surface temperature deviations from normal in the tropical Pacific. El Nino on top here experiences warm sea surface temperature anomalies. These maps show the deviation from normal temperature, and you can see that in an El Nino event, the deviation is warm across a large swath of the eastern and central tropical Pacific. By contrast, the flip side of El Nino is La Nina, and that is defined by cooler temperatures across the tropical Pacific. This back and forth of warm and cool temperatures is the primary source of year-to-year climate variability across the world, and it's especially strong throughout the tropics and subtropics and in the Pacific Basin. So how does this work? Well, we can start, when we think about the things that are involved with El Nino and La Nina, we start with a picture at the top here that shows what we consider to be neutral or normal conditions. And what we see here is a cross-section of the ocean with this blue sort of flying carpet representing the thermocline of the ocean. The thermocline is the layer above which the water is warm and below which the water is cold. So when the thermocline comes to the surface, that means cold water is reaching the surface. During these neutral conditions, we have strong trade winds that blow across the ocean from east to west. Those trade winds push this cool water across the hot equatorial latitudes here, and the water heats up under the hot equatorial sun. And so we see warm conditions in the west, cool conditions in the east, rising air over that warm water that drives rainfall in the west, and sinking air that brings drier conditions in the east. Now, these winds fluctuate over the year and also randomly. And when trade winds weaken, that transition is shown in the lower diagram here. The trade winds actually prop up a slope of sea level such that the sea level is higher in the west than the east. And when those winds weaken, that slope relaxes and warm water moves back across the tropical Pacific and warms across the tropical Pacific more generally, developing into an El Nino situation. The rising air over warm water also shifts to the western or central, Pacific here, and the trade winds remain sort of weak and variable. Okay. Over time, those trade winds pick back up again, though, and start to, again, push warm water back across the Pacific to the west. And what we see is if they get strong enough, we may even develop into a cooler than normal condition known as La Nina, which creates cold anomalies across the Pacific. Okay. So this is a coupling of the ocean and atmosphere that is characteristic of El Nino. And I'll use the term ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, because El Nino refers to the sea surface temperature changes associated with this. The Southern Oscillation refers to the shifts in where the convective system lies. So the atmospheric piece. Okay. The Galapagos Islands are uniquely well located to keep track of or to feel the El Nino events in the Eastern Pacific. Here, changes in upwelling water provide a very strong sea surface temperature signal of El Nino condition. And the Galapagos Islands lie in a region where strong El Nino events, like this one shown here in 1997-98, are most influential. These very strong events have the greatest impacts on climate hazards, but they're not the only kind of El Nino event. And so here I'm showing that same map in the upper left, but also some other El Nino events where the pattern is not quite the same. And what you can see is that some of these events have sea surface temperature warmings that extend across the Pacific, whereas others have warmings that are located only in a smaller area, perhaps in the Central Pacific. And so there's different styles of El Nino, Eastern Pacific and Central Pacific. Our Galapagos data tell us a lot about Eastern Pacific events, And I've also put, and that's in the green star, I've also shown the purple star here, which is another set of coral-based climate records that ask the same question from the Central Pacific perspective. And I'll show results from both of these areas and give you a sense of a bigger picture of recent El Nino variability. I mentioned that El Nino is a major source of climate impacts worldwide. These maps here show us the El Nino climate impacts on the left, the La Nina impacts on the right, and you can see that much of the world is affected by this. And so, for example, during an El Nino, we have warmer and wetter conditions across the tropics. I already showed you what's behind that, the sea surface temperature changes and the movement of that convective zone. There's drought in the areas that are normally wet across the maritime continent here in northern Australia. And there's impacts up through Central and North America. You can see that across southern US and northern Mexico, for example, we have cooler and wetter conditions during El Nino. But over here on the La Nina side, on the right, drier conditions when the Pacific is cooler. Okay, and these impacts extend across from South America to Africa. It's worth remembering that the strongest events, the strongest El Nino events, have the broadest impacts and are the most devastating for people. El Nino events affect things that we care about, and I'm going to show you some examples of the impacts of a strong event that happened recently in 2015 and 2016, where we see devastating drought in Java in Indonesia that strongly reduced the rice harvest. We saw extensive bushfires across Australia where that drought created the conditions for burning. We saw flooding, meanwhile, in East Africa, and this is a picture from Kenya with dramatic increases in rainfall during that El Nino. Further north from Kenya in Ethiopia, an extensive drought created what was then at the time one of the biggest famines in the last 50 years in Ethiopia. And these shifts in temperature and rainfall carry changes in disease and health risks. Some of those are due to changes in disease vectors like mosquito-borne diseases that are more easily transmitted if conditions are wetter. Others are related to air quality. For example, where there's fires, we see an increase in respiratory illnesses. And so El Nino affects food, it affects water, it affects health. It's something that is super impactful. It also affects extreme events. And across the Central Pacific, we saw this record smashing. I'm just going to get rid of this. Hang on. There we go. We saw this cyclone season in 2015 that just smashed all previous records for the number of cyclones. Something like 3 times the number of named storms were identified across the Central Pacific as the next largest year. So this is an image. You can see Hawaii here in the background, off in the subtropical Pacific. But of course, hurricane conditions across the tropical and subtropical oceans are affected by this rearrangement of temperatures. And I want to just show this figure because it highlights not only do we get more hurricanes across this warmer area, but we also get, a change in hurricanes associated with vertical wind shear. That is an important precursor for whether hurricanes can develop or not. And so we see increase in hurricane frequency on the Pacific side of Mexico, some that make their way up the Gulf of California into the Southwest US. Fewer hurricanes can develop in the Caribbean and Atlantic because of the increase in wind shear in that area. And again, that is also impacting Central America and the tip of the Yucatan there. Another influence on Mexico pertains to the Gulf of California, which has normally got high productivity and upwelling from various different forcings across the length of the Gulf. But this map here contrasts the winter of 2007 and 2008 with high chlorophyll values in green shown across the Gulf. Here's the winter of 2015-16, that strong El Nino, and you can see that all of those values are much reduced during that time. due to a combination of ocean and atmospheric forcing. Okay? So lots of impacts on things that we care about, including productivity in a very rich fishing zone here in Mexico. So how well do we know about El Nino? It would help us to know a long history of El Nino if we wanted to understand whether El Nino is going to change or is changing already in response to global warming. This is a plot of sea surface temperature anomalies or variations in the central Pacific that is used as an index of El Nino, and the red tends to be El Nino events and the blue are La Nina events. And this data set is derived from gridded sea surface temperatures, but it is based on vanishingly small numbers of actual observations early in the record. Before about 1950, there are very, very few actual observations in the tropical Pacific, and most of those data are developed using clever statistical interpolation methods from other parts of the world. Okay, so even since 1950, though, the number of observations in the part of the Pacific that's really core to El Nino is very small. This is a map showing the mean number of monthly sea surface temperature observations from ships in the 15 years between 1950 and 1965. You can see that they are concentrated along ship tracks. Those are the green stripes going across the ocean. But the white and blue areas are very poorly observed. And the region that we use to define whether El Nino is happening or not, shown in the blue box here, has almost no observations during this time. So we have to get all the way to the satellite era that began in 1982 before we have a really global coverage for sea surface temperature, including these remote areas of the tropical Pacific. We really don't have a good observational basis for identifying long-term trends in El Nino, which is why we need to resort to using the paleoclimate record that is preserved in corals that grow in the tropical ocean to fill this gap. So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so taking stock then, we have few instrumental data, and the paleoclimate data that we have from land, for example, from tree rings and lakes and others, are not well located to sense El Nino variations, and they show inconsistent patterns of change across the last few hundred years. So that means we don't understand internal natural variability very well, and we cannot tell whether we have long-term trends that are happening now. So what do climate models say about ongoing trends? Well, using climate, because this is our goal, right, is to understand how El Nino is changing now and how it may then change in the future. So in 2018, a paper came out that identified some models that distinguished Eastern Pacific and Central Pacific kinds of events, so models that had certain capabilities, right, showed that in the Eastern Pacific, El Nino ENSO will strengthen as climate warms, meaning higher variations, right, stronger events, okay? That's using just the models that actually separate these two styles of events, okay? So that's an early paper suggesting increased ENSO strength. The IPCC, however, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is regarded as a state-of-the-art assessment of the science of climate change, the most recent report in 2021 combined all climate models from recent vintage and said that there was no consensus in those models on whether ENSO would strengthen or weaken. No consensus, okay, among all models. A couple of years ago, again, using a subset of models that do show strengthening, because some show strengthening and some show weakening, right? Or some show stability, right? But if you just look at the ones that show strengthening, this paper in 2022, Ying et al. Suggested that that signal of strengthening will become detectable, that is, emerge from the background natural variability around 2070. So we have some time before it actually gets unusual. Finally, a subsequent paper that came out looking separately again at Eastern Pacific and Central Pacific El Ninos said actually the Eastern Pacific El Ninos are going to strengthen faster, and that they will start to appear as stronger than background variability, that is, emerge from the background around 2030. Like, that's almost tomorrow, right? So there's, I guess, a variety of opinions and an emerging consensus that the Eastern Pacific El Nino is likely to strengthen soon. All right. So that's what we see from the climate model side of things. So how can we use other kinds of data from corals to test some of these ideas? Well, that's what I'm going to show you now. But just a quick wrap up, we're going to focus here on the strengthening of El Nino because the strong events are the most devastating. And ask the question, are strong basin-wide El Nino events becoming more common? And by asking this question, we basically address what is the baseline of natural variations that has shaped modern human and ecological systems, right? What does the baseline look like, and then what is the deviation that's happening now, if any? Focus on Galapagos. Galapagos is uniquely well located for El Nino studies. There are very few islands in this part of the world, and here what we've done is taken sea surface temperature at Galapagos and correlated it with a couple things. In the purple map on the left, we've correlated it with the sea surface temperature index that's used to define whether we're in an El Nino or La Nina, and you can see that we're in an area of strong correlation. On the right here, we've taken the sea surface temperature from Galapagos and used it to correlate here with a index of Eastern Pacific only variations. And you can see that it's exceptionally well located to sense those strong Eastern Pacific events. All right, Galapagos has corals growing in it, and some of these actually are fairly old. I learned when I went back to Galapagos, I learned of a reef that had actually survived the 1982-83 event at the northernmost islands of Galapagos, and a picture of one of the ancient corals from that reef is shown on the right here. That coral is about 150 years old. On the left, I'm showing an image that we just took last month in Galapagos from the Central Archipelago, showing how corals have regrown since the massive mortality that happened in 1982-83. That's an amazing picture from Galapagos. There are corals everywhere. It's not a very diverse reef. There are not very many species, but those that are there seem to be hanging in there pretty well. The white tips are some of that is cold water bleaching on some of these. So in Galapagos, we get bleaching from cold as well as warm water. And then some of them are parrotfish bites, because there's parrotfish that like to bite at the organic matter on the corals and eat them. So that's why they're kind of speckled. All right, we're using a pneumatic drill there to drill into a living coral. All right. So a little bit about paleoclimate records from corals. The species that we like the most is usually from the genus Porites, the massive forms of Porites, like the pictures I just showed you. Porites lobata are what we're using here. These have growth rates of over 1 centimeter a year. And so we can sample them at millimeter scale resolution we take a core out of them, and then we sample them back in the lab at 1 millimeter intervals, and we get monthly or better resolution of samples. We are able to core modern corals that can extend back more than a century, and we are also able to find corals that have been washed up on the beach by tsunamis or tectonic events or storms that we can date with the uranium-thorium methods, and these can span multiple decades, and I'm showing some pictures of those here. We see a coral being held down stably while my colleague Sandy Tuthope drills them. Simon Villamar, who's holding this down, is a park ranger in the Galapagos. Here's another picture just showing how these corals have density bands. This happens to have weathered, and you can see those annual bands pretty clearly. We measure the geochemistry of the skeleton, and I'm going to focus on strontium-calcium ratios in the skeletal carbonate, and I'm also going to focus on the oxygen isotope composition of that carbonate. This is a video that was taken underwater, showing us drilling a large core. You can kind of hear the breathing and the bubbling here. I am drilling, and next to me, Jennifer Suarez I'm turn that down. Next to me, Jennifer Suarez is she's a intern there at the park. She's now the head ecologist at the Galapagos National Park, but this was in 2016 or 2015. We were at Darwin Island. She's pumping water that runs through the drill and down the core barrel here to flush out the sediment and keep our drill from jamming. I'm having a little trouble, and that's why I'm moving the drill up and down to get some of that sediment out, so you can get a sense of what we're doing here. The yellow hose goes to a scuba tank underneath the coral here that is giving the air pressure that drives the drill to power through this coral. The rope that's going off in the distance there is an anchor line, and the fact that it's so slanted tells you that there's a very strong current at the surface. You can see that current sweeping our bubbles away as well. It's moderate at depth, but it's very strong at the surface. This is somewhat challenging diving, but it's also really spectacular in terms of the kinds of things that you can see underwater. In fact, once I was drilling, and when I came up, I was told that an orca had actually swum past me, which I missed. So that was sad to have missed that. But anyway, that's what it looks like to do this work. Oh, you can see one of our cores sitting there that we've taken out already. All right, I'm going to skip that. I want to show you here some of the data, the kinds of data that we generate from these corals. So these data sets are plotted with age. The x-axis here goes from 1985 up to 2015. And the y-axis shows the oxygen isotopes in the bluish colors and the strontium calcium ratios in the orangish colors, and then measured ocean temperature from satellite data in the purple colors down below. So both the oxygen isotope, and we're looking at 4 different corals here, 3 from Isla Wolf and 1 from Isla Darwin, all in the northern part of the archipelago. And what you can see is that the corals tend to agree pretty well in the ups and downs of these data. You can see seasonal cycles. You can also see that some years are highly unusual. This 1997-98 year stands out. And both of these track sea surface temperature pretty well. When we take the average values of O18 and the average values of strontium, those are shown here in the blue colors, and those agree quite well. We've plotted them here on top of indices of Eastern Pacific El Niño variability, and they agree with those indices pretty well. Again, just showing that this method works to track past climate variability. The maps at the bottom show the correlation of coral data with sea surface temperature anomalies. And again, you see this pattern of that's El Niño-like in that correlation. So we're confident that our data reflect the history of variability in ENSO. The temperatures and variability are not homogeneous across the Galapagos. The islands to the north here are much warmer. The islands to the south are cooler. These stars are showing sites with corals that I'm going to be showing you in a few minutes here. But I want you to know that there's gradients across the archipelago that we have to correct for in terms of both mean and variability in order to compare our sites from the north and our sites from the south. Okay. Just showing that data here, the mean sea surface temperature at our 4 different islands varies across a range of about 3 or 4 degrees. And the cold season data are much more variable across islands than the warm season data. I'm going to be using a measure of variability to talk about strength changes in ENSO, the changes in the strength of ENSO. And so I'm pointing out here that the standard deviation of temperature is much higher at the cooler sites, Irvine Bay here, than it is at the warmer sites, Wolf and Darwin here. And again, we correct for that statistically to be able to compare these records. Okay, so I have data from 5 islands across the archipelago, 13 colonies, all but 1 are the same species. We have 15 oxygen isotope records and 14 strontium calcium records. That's because some of them are discontinuous, so we have a top record and a bottom record. All of the modern records have a multi-year gap related to the 1982-83 El Niño event, and so we consider the top and bottom parts separately. It's because they died, because that was a huge El Niño. Now, we develop a measure of ENSO variability that we apply to all of our corals All right, so I want to show you how we do that. Here's an example of some of the data in the 1700s. The original data is gathered here, and we've interpolated it to 6 samples per year. We remove the seasonal cycle from that data. We convert it using a modern calibration to a sea surface temperature anomaly. We then filter it to remove long-term variability greater than 10 years, and we smooth it to remove subannual variability. Then we take a running 20-year standard deviation that reflects the strength of events. And that's the measure of ENSO that we have. We have a mean value, a max, and a min. Here are the 20-year standard deviations for all of our corals. This is plotted on an x-axis that is discontinuous in time. So these, at the far left, we have corals from about 1,000 years ago. We've got a group around 1,300, a group around 1,600, a group across the 1700s, and then the last century here at the far right. Okay, the gray shading is 95%, is the 95% range of the pre-industrial variability. And what I want to highlight here is that in the 20th century, we start to emerge above that level, even in the mid-20th century. And our data sets that post-date the 1982 event are much stronger. Here, each coral is represented just by a dot, and the lines or the uncertainties on these are the ranges. They're not uncertainties. They're the length of the record horizontally and the max and min vertically. And again, what we can see is a big change, almost like a hockey stick, in the variance of ENSO coming up to present. Here, I've graphed this as a percent change in ENSO strength. And what I want to highlight here is that scaled to the modern variance, pre-industrial ENSO was about 64% of current strength. That is, ENSO was 36% weaker in the pre-industrial than it is now. 36%, that's a big number for tropical variability. So how reasonable is that? We can ask the same question of data from the Line Islands. We take data from Pam Grothy's paper and some subsequent analyses from the Northern Line Islands here in the Central Pacific and process them exactly the same way. I'm going to skip this slide and go straight to the punchline. So we reanalyzed the Line Islands data, and those data are shown on the bottom of this plot, showing the change over time in the percent of modern ENSO strength. So let me say that again. These are plots of the percent change from modern El Nino variability, right? And I've already said that El Nino at Galapagos, we see an El Nino weakening of about 36%. That's the average of all these lines. And then the modern data are here. I've superimposed our Galapagos data here on top with a record of change in temperature, so global warming, right? Derived from the Pages project and the uncertainty shown in gray. And you can see that the intensification of ENSO really parallels the warming of the planet. We see a similar pattern in the Line Islands, but with somewhat more noise or variability in the early part of the record compared to the latest. In other words, there's a much stronger signal of this in the Eastern Pacific, which is really consistent with what some of the climate models were saying, right? So when we do the calculation, we find that the strengthening of ENSO is something on the order of 36% from Galapagos, and in the Northern Line Islands, it's about 38% with a larger variability because of this larger range in the early part. Okay, so ENSO is strengthening across the Pacific at more or less consistent rates. That is pretty consistent with this last paper that I showed you earlier, that Eastern Pacific changes in ENSO are likely to emerge earlier. However, we're seeing it happening already. We do not have to wait till 2030 to see this happening in our records. We're seeing it now. Okay, so that's, I guess, the big take-home message here is that our data are suggesting that El Nino is changing in strength. It's changing. It has changed significantly since the pre-industrial era, and it's happening already. Another interesting point, actually, I didn't highlight this, but across the last millennium, these values are pretty consistent in the Eastern Pacific, not so much in the Central Pacific, but that's somewhat remarkable as well. and we've quantified that now. So the amplification is clearer in the eastern than in the central Pacific, and our results are consistent with model-based projection that anticipate a strengthening of eastern Pacific ENSO. But we think it's happening faster than expected. Now, maybe this is an important tool that we can use. So, as I said before, there's lots of variability among the different climate models used to project future change. Is it possible we might be able to identify models that are doing a particularly good job using this comparison? Maybe, okay. It's important to remember that this isn't just about sea surface temperature in the tropical Pacific, but it's about thinking about the risks that we face in a warming climate. Projections of future climate change are likely underestimating the speed at which ENSO-related climate risks will intensify. And as we've seen, that includes drought and flood, fire, storms, food, health, all the things that we care about, right? As well, we know that these stresses, these climate risks that we face are also stresses on natural ecosystems. And as someone who works on coral reefs, I'm acutely aware of the challenges that coral reefs are facing in a warming world. We've lost half the world's coral in the last 50 years, right? And increased variability, increased El Niño frequency of these strong events will place greater and greater stresses on coral ecosystems and give them less time to recover between strong events. So I'll wrap up there, I guess. Oh, one thing I want to mention is as we are doing this work, one of the things that we're doing is trying to document the signal that's preserved in modern corals. And so this is just a map of what I've been doing the last year, going back to Galapagos, collecting cores around the archipelago, and taking water samples on the dotted lines that you're seeing connecting these islands to try to understand better the geochemistry of the water and its variability across the archipelago, and think about ways we might use different aspects of the geochemistry of the skeletons to do things like help us trace upwelling, for example. The upwelling is strongest here to the western side in this green dot where it's cooler. And so just thinking about that as I was talking with Jaime earlier today about the cruises that you all have planned up along the coast of, all along the coast of Central and South America. And this kind of water sampling can be super interesting for paleoclimate work to try to better understand the signals that are preserved in our records. So things like phosphorus calcium ratios, for example, to tell us about nutrients. All right, I'll conclude with just an acknowledgement of my collaborators. It takes a lot of people to do this kind of work, and I've been very lucky to work with some great people over the years. NSF support as well was very helpful in all this. And Lenin Cruz, captain of a boat who took us around to find all these fossil corals. Thanks to him.
Thanks very much, Julie. It's a fascinating study. We have many actually messages. Congratulations, incredible studies. I wish I can join you there. Okay, well, sounds good. Let me read some of the questions. One is, it says that I didn't know that fossil corals can disappear. Did I understand well? The fossil corals are being eaten?
That's exactly right. And we didn't expect that either. It was a surprise. And there are many organisms in the ocean in Galapagos that will take advantage of a coral that has died. And sea urchins, really these big pencil urchins, will burrow in. We have burrows from clams. We have parrotfish that are biting at it. And I think one of the things that makes that happen more in Galapagos, maybe than elsewhere, two things, right? One is the nutrient content of the waters is very high. It's a very rich, productive ecosystem. So lots of different organisms there that might want to burrow in and get the organic material that's part of the skeleton and eat that. But the other thing to think about is because they're growing in an upwelling zone, they're growing in waters of low pH, and the coral skeletal density is actually quite low. Like when we take a core from Galapagos and we slice it, we have to slice it 2 or 3 times thicker than our cores from other reefs, because it'll just crumble in our hands if we slice it thinly. So we can see in our lab a very clear indication that these corals are very fragile, much more so than corals in other parts of the tropics.
Oh, wow. Are the corals also affected by La Niña events? What happens when the water is cooler?
Yeah, that's a great question. In Galapagos, it's unusual in the sense that we see cold water bleaching in Galapagos, right? So the water can actually get cold enough that the corals will start to bleach. Bleach means that they are losing their photosynthetic algae that live within the tissues and help to make food for them. When conditions get stressful, the algae leave, right? These are dinoflagellates, Symbiodiniaceae family. The algae leave, and so the coral turns bright white. And if they are gone long enough, the coral cannot sustain itself and it will die. But it can also reacquire those algae and keep growing. So in Galapagos, we see some of that stress response during La Nina events as well, and also during the warm events. Corals really don't like change. They really like things to be stable, which makes Galapagos a very challenging place to be a coral because there's so much variation.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very interesting location. A related question is what drives La Nina events? Are the ocean circulation, the currents? Why the currents reverse?
Oh, how does a La Nina event develop?
Yes, but the driving mechanisms.
Yeah, so it is about the strengthening of the trade winds and the creation of a strong gradient in sea surface temperature across the Pacific. And the stronger that gradient, the stronger the trade winds, and the stronger the upwelling, and the more the cooling. So there's like a positive, both El Nino and La Nina have positive feedbacks that help to maintain them for some period of time before it becomes unstable. And in the case of La Nina, it's when the trade winds become very strong and the strong gradient sets up across the Pacific. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, I suppose yes. And we have actually several questions. If there are coral reefs in the continental margin, I suppose Ecuador and Colombia coast.
Yeah, so there are fewer than you might imagine because the water is so cold and caustic, so low in pH. But there are some corals along the coast there. I've always been curious about those, but haven't gotten there. In Isla de la Plata, in Ecuador, and then going up into Colombia, I think there are, but I'm not. That's one area I don't know. I'm starting a little bit of a project in the other side of Colombia, in the Caribbean, but I don't know the Pacific side as well. Certainly as you move up, though, through Central America, there are corals on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica and up into Mexico even.
Oh, okay. Sounds interesting. And we have one question about one of your last slides, mentioning this the hiatus for the 1982 El Niño event. What happened?
Yeah. So the corals that we sampled in Wolf and Darwin Islands to the far north, right, appear to have survived that event because they're still growing and they're very big. But when we took a core through them, every one of them you could see where the coral had died. And when we got the corals back to the lab, we could prove that death happened during that 1982-83 El Nino. So we think what happens is, the coral's growing up through time. It's kind of a round surface. It dies on top. And so you think of the living tissue maybe hanging on at some small part of the coral. Then when conditions get better, it can start to grow over again and eventually grow back. So we can't be sure how long the coral was dead, because all we know is when that tissue reached the center part where we're coring, right? It may have been living around the outside, but dead on top, and then started to regrow. But we can see clearly that other organisms started to colonize the surface of the coral when it was dead. So when we take a core through, we can see precipitation of cements, we can see some little tube worms, and sometimes even some bivalves that are kind of adhered to the surface. And so we can see clearly that there was a time that it died.
Okay. Well, this also addresses some of the questions they were asking if the hiatus meant that the corals died. And
yeah, that's a great question. A coral is a colony, right? A coral is a colony of organisms that covers this large thing. So some of the members of that colony die back, but then they can grow back again like that. So is it the same exact coral? Yes, I think it is. But obviously it needs to acquire symbionts back, because it's lost its symbionts. They have to come back, and then it has to grow back. And so it takes some time to do that.
Okay, sounds interesting. Let me we have a question about the corals and the fishes, okay. And if this I suppose these changes with El Niño and La Niña affect also the fishes and the fisheries.
Yeah, absolutely. The El Niño and La Niña effect on fisheries is really strong. So when El Niño happens, the upwelling of nutrient-rich waters is shut down, is pushed to much deeper levels. So we don't see highly productive surface waters. We don't see high productivity in the surface waters. The chlorophyll data from satellites shows that really clearly. And that's the base of the ocean food chain, right? So we lose all this primary production that is supporting the fisheries in the Eastern Pacific. And so absolutely, El Niño, it has a major impact on the fisheries in the Eastern Pacific and in Galapagos. In fact, the first people to recognize El Niño were fishermen in Peru. And what they noticed every winter around Christmas time is there would be a warm current. They called it El Corriente del Niño because it came at the same time as Christmas. And so, yeah. And but they noticed that some years it would last longer, and some years it would even stay all year long. And those became identified as the El Niño years, that would be more impactful, let's say, throughout the world. There's a natural weakening of that current every year around late December, early January, but it's when that current really shuts down that it becomes noticeable more worldwide. But fishermen were very attuned to this in like the 16th century. So.
But this same person, Felipe Ortiz, also asked about if there is a contamination or pollution in the Galapagos with the boats and tourists.
That's a great question, Felipe. That's a really yeah. It's interesting. The place I see that myself the most is when we're doing work on land to look for the fossil corals on the beaches. Mm-hmm. We see so much plastic on islands that nobody ever goes to, but these are islands that might be facing towards the continente, towards South America, and we see just lots and lots of plastic on the beaches. So that's really visible. In terms of the water quality, I don't think that's as much of a big concern there. They're out far from land, and there's lots of currents kind of sweeping through. So the water quality itself doesn't seem to be affected because there's just lots of circulation and waves and wind and mixing it all around. But for sure, plastic.
Ah, okay. Well, a related question by Marcela, just arrived actually. Marcela Elizalde, she's asking if there are some protection similar to well, if the corals are protected by the, I don't know, regulations in Galapagos and Ecuador.
Yeah. So all of Galapagos is a national park, and there are different zonations for where people can do different things, right? And so as researchers, we're allowed to sample almost anywhere, but of course we have to go through permission, and we have to get permission from the park. They're very careful about how many corals can we sample. We have to put a little plug in the hole when we take a drill core to allow the coral to grow over easier. And then there are areas where some fishing can happen, areas that are more open to fishing, areas that are completely forbidden to fish. So that's what the regulations look like. The reality is that it's a constant battle in Galapagos to push back against illegal fishing. And often there will be very large commercial fishing boats from other countries coming in just off of the Galapagos, just outside the line, or sometimes even crossing the line to fish, because it's a very productive system. So it's a constant struggle, but there is protection.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, we keep receiving messages from many people, and but well, Dr. Cole has also an appointment later, so we will just take one more question. But thanks to well, let me read some of the names. We have messages. Congratulations from the London office, the UNAM London office. Thanks very much. And from many different places in Mexico, many of the universities, the University of Tlaxcala, Mexico, saludos from Ciencias del Mar. It's a bit difficult here to check, but thanks a lot. And we will just take a final question, and I think it's related to the comparison you made with the Line Island record. If there is a gradient across the Central Pacific, or why you said that the warmer water is more in Galapagos than in the Central Pacific. Is the circulation affected, or is just the atmosphere-ocean interaction? I think they are asking about why you have these differences in the records from Line Island and Galapagos.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of reasons. One has to do with the fact that the corals from the Line Islands are also telling us about rainfall, because in the Line Islands, they're only looking at the oxygen isotope composition of the skeletons. That also reflects salinity. In the Galapagos, the salinity is pretty constant, so we don't have to worry about that. But in the Line Islands, there's a lot of precipitation that affects the salinity where the corals grow. So that's one reason, is that the records themselves are telling us about a little bit more than just temperature. But I think there's another reason related to how the Central Pacific El Niños work, where the And I don't exactly know, I don't know the details of exactly why this is, but we know that in climate models, we see that same pattern where the Eastern Pacific emerges faster than the Central Pacific. Maybe it's just because the Eastern Pacific has stronger signal to noise because there's more temperature variation in the East compared to the Central. So it may just be that we're able to see it outside the boundaries of the noise. Those are my best guesses.
Okay. And
I'm sorry, I have to go. It's a meeting with my boss, so I can't
yes.
be late. I'm sorry.
Oh no, thanks very much, and thanks to all of those for sending us questions. We will send them to Julie.
Okay,
So
great.
we
Do
can.
that and I'll reply.
Okay. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
And thanks again to everyone, and thanks, Julie. We will be very happy to have you again here very soon about
Thank
this
you.
continuation of the Galapagos study.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Compromiso anterior y ya la perdimos aquí.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Pues solamente para agradecer tu intervención, para la participación de la doctora Julie. La verdad sí, hoy conocemos más del niño y de la niña y lo que son cosas ciertas y las que les hemos imputado al cabo del tiempo. Yo creo que hay de las dos. Pues lo que se acredita es que hay pues un enorme campo de investigación en muchísimos temas y seguramente nuestra audiencia pues podrá participar activamente en encontrar espacios de especialización, espacios de conocimiento, espacios de investigación a lo que hoy se nos ha presentado. Además, nuevamente se acredita pues la capacidad de convocatoria que tiene el doctor Urrutia, la doctora Araxi, para invitar a distintos integrantes académicos de nuestra comunidad y de otras comunidades científicas involucradas en la educación superior y que forma parte de nuestro consorcio. Así que agradecemos mucho al doctor Urrutia, agradecemos a la Universidad Nacional pues las facilidades que siempre nos presta, al Colegio Nacional que fue sede de este evento formidable y pues a todos ustedes que participan con su entusiasmo, con su dedicación, con su participación activa cada semana en la realización de estos eventos. Así que ese es el propósito de esta intervención final. Agradecer nuevamente la participación y por favor, por tu conducto, agradecer a la doctora Julie de mi parte haber participado también en el evento de hoy y pues seguir contando con ustedes cada semana. El próximo martes todavía tendremos un programa de Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia y pues agradecemos de veras su participación activa. Muchas gracias, Jaime, muchas gracias a todos quienes hacen posible la presentación con su apoyo para la realización de estas presentaciones del Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia. Ya sabemos, Jaime, de qué va a tratar la próxima semana para que lo compartamos con nuestra audiencia.
Sí, tenemos una presentación sobre estudios en la parte de médica de salud, en la parte de la placenta, y es a cargo de un investigador que está en la Universidad de Cambridge. Déjenme, les paso el em, es a cargo del doctor Elías Ruiz Morales, Universidad de Cambridge, en el Reino Unido, y es cómo funciona la placenta para prevenir infecciones. O sea, qué papel tiene la placenta, además de mantener, bueno, de ser el conducto para alimentación y crear las condiciones de vida. ¿Qué hace para proteger de infecciones? Y el doctor Elías Ruiz, pues es uno de nuestros investigadores de aquí que ahora está allá en Inglaterra.
Pues muchas gracias. Suena también una presentación formidable y acredita que en esas presentaciones pues vamos desde el microscopio hasta el telescopio. Así que agradecemos mucho y pues esto refuerza nuestro interés en participar en estas presentaciones que se hace cada semana en nuestros consorcios. Gracias de nuevo, gracias Jaime, gracias a Araxi, gracias al Colegio Nacional, a las autoridades de la Universidad Nacional y a todos quienes con su apoyo hacen posible la presentación de estas pláticas semana a semana. Gracias de nuevo y seguimos en contacto.